In one of our past case files, we delved into the grimy underbelly of lost and forgotten fighting games from perennial Flophouse Files suspect Midway Entertainment. Today, another case has slid across my desk from my informant, McMuscles, who has tasked me with investigating a publisher that forgets about their fighting games more than anyone. Sega, whose list of MIA franchises is incredibly long and incredibly embarrassing. What I'll be doing specifically is getting to the truth of the matter regarding one of these franchises, and the rumor that Sega self-sabotaged it for absolutely no reason at all, which is something Sega has done in the past. It's a shocking tale of mysterious mismanagement that I like to call the case of the not-so-eternal champions. These things start, like most fighting game stories do, with the marginal success of something called Fighting the Street 2. Many other publishers, inspired by the idea of making tons of cash, set to work trying to carve out their own slice of the lucrative fighting game pie. Sega, though, decided to do this on two very different fronts. Sega of Japan would focus on the arcade scene and the fancy schmancy 3D polygons of Virtua Fighter, headed up by their golden goose, Yu Suzuki. Meanwhile, Sega of America, who worked very independently from Japan at that time, decided to push forward a fighting game of their own, and the resident Street Fighter II office champion, Michael Landham, was more than ready to accept this job that he was passed over for. Instead, senior producer Scott Burfield was given that job instead, and drafted up a few ideas before he suddenly decided to quit Sega altogether. Thus, fate smiled and then turned her head towards Michael Landham once again, and his dream job of creating a fighting game was now his, because the last one he worked on, could have gone better.
Welcome to the Fight Palace.
Now, when it came to the design work that had been started on this project, Michael, well, he threw out pretty much everything, except for, wait, I have it in the file here. The one thing he kept was the character of Shadow Yamato. For obvious reasons. Check out those gams! From that point forward, Michael went hard on creating elaborate backstories for each character and drafted up a rough 3-arc story treatment, which saw a mystical being known as the Eternal Champion giving the gift of life to a number of damned souls who had met an untimely end. The fighters included the aforementioned Shadow Yamato, Larson, Midnight, Blade, no, not that Blade, but they look alike, whatever, Jetta, Trident, Slash, Xavier, and Rax. Not only did each warrior have detailed histories, but Michael wanted as many of their special moves and attacks to be based on some semblance of real martial arts. Also, the game's button layout was even specifically designed to take advantage of the 6-button Genesis pad, as well as with one of the most dustbin-destined peripherals of all time, the Activator.
What a piece of shit.
Sega of America was indeed pulling out all the stops. Now, while Eternal Champion sought to unseat Street Fighter II, it also had its eye firmly set on Mortal Kombat as well, which is pretty evident by this over-the-top and poorly aged comic book advertisement. In a full-force attack, Blade bumbles Slash in China. Look at these warriors, they're huge! A wimp like Blanca wouldn't stand a chance. To prepare for Eternal Champions, use Street Fighter II as your training wheels. The battle room, where the room itself can sap your strength. Here, Jetta does a little sapping of her own with a double-fisted air dive on Shadow. Hey, Johnny Cage, scared you'll get whipped by a girl? It tackled Mortal Kombat even more directly by adding a helping of good old over-the-top ultra-violence. While characters couldn't perform individual fatalities, each stage had their own finisher, with some being particularly detailed and gruesomely memorable. Eternal Champions also featured a training room with extensive options, including damaging traps and various other effects. While the combat mostly stayed true to the one-on-one fighting formula, EC also changed things up by introducing a chi system, which would govern the frequency you could throw out special moves. This gauge was affected by taunts and other actions, so while it was very clear that marketing-wise, Eternal Champions was taking cheap shots at its competitors, it was anything but a carbon copy. Because of that, and the fact it was a first-party Sega release, Eternal Champions was a success, and while exact sales numbers are not known, it appeared on several labels heralding said success, including Sega's Platinum Collection. Additionally, the game was even able to stir up some merchandise, such as appearing in the official Sonic the Hedgehog comic book, and eventually got its own dedicated special issue. There were even early talks of Eternal Champions being adapted into a Saturday morning cartoon, as was the style at the time. However, the game released in late 1993, which just so happened to be the same year Virtua Fighter also hit the arcade beat, and this left Sega Japan in a bit of a pickle, or more accurately, a pickle of their own creation. Yu Suzuki was one of their star creators, and thus his baby, Virtua Fighter, needed all the attention, especially since no publisher, outside SNK, had more than one successful fighting game franchise in 1993. Sega felt the sales and popularity of one game was hurting the other. Thus, despite EC's success, it was decided that instead of receiving a full-fledged sequel, it would be relegated to a Sega CD exclusive upgrade with a few added characters, backgrounds, and gameplay tweaks. Eternal Champions, Challenge from the Dark Side, was Michael Landham and his team making the best out of an unideal situation, cramming the game with as much as they possibly could. They utilized the CD medium for fancy CGI cinekills, which showed the Eternal Champion dusting a particular character in spectacular fashion, well, as spectacular as you can be by grainy reboot Season 1 standards. Now, that didn't mean that the game was a slouch visually in some other areas, because while the Sega CD was notorious for its limited color display, which is why many of its games had a gross, washed-out kind of look, Challenge from the Dark Side was able to push 256 colors on screen at once, leading to one of the better-looking games on the terrible add-on. Unique fatalities called Vendettas were also added to each character's arsenal, with this cast of newcomers including Raven, Dawson McShane, Ramses III, Riptide, Blast, Chin, as well as the Eternal Champion and the Dark Champion. Furthermore, there were also a number of bonus parody characters, including Hooters, Yappy, Crispy, Zuni, Slither, and of course, Senator. All the elaborate stage overkills were back in full force, with some pushing the limits of pixelated punishment. All in all, while it's seen as a very big improvement on the first game, it being a Sega CD exclusive limited its appeal and saw far fewer sales. Still though, Michael's team at Sega of America were given small opportunities to expand the franchise with spin-off projects, including the nice-looking but dreadfully plain Experts starring Shadow Yamamoto, and the very obscure Game Gear exclusive Chicago Syndicate, which showcased Larson in a leading role. However, since these spin-offs released at the very end of both machines' lifespans, they again saw very little popularity. Since the sales of the Genesis original were still so encouraging, Sega of America wanted to push forward with a proper sequel on new hardware, and thus started pre-production. As mentioned earlier, Michael Landham had written 20 pages of lore, with Eternal Champions, the final chapter, being the final chapter. Meanwhile, Sega of Japan were getting fustigated as Virtua Fighter was failing to catch on in the home as it did in the arcades. This was due to the competent, but because of the hardware, low-selling Virtua Fighter 32X, as well as the rushed and somewhat underwhelming Saturn version. And with Virtua Fighter 2 still a long way off from getting its home port, Sega were scrambling to try and course-correct these mistakes to make VF a marquee game. So, with 2 botched versions already behind them, desperation really sunk in, which of course resulted in which is the most desperate thing I've ever seen. Now, while it makes sense to utilize the much bigger install base of the Genesis, this attempt at trying to get Virtua Fighter out there was ill-advised. The later we go into the 90s, Sega of America unfortunately saw much of their autonomy taken away, and their ability to greenlight projects was severely kneecapped, leaving Sega of Japan in charge of those decisions. Michael had an ambitious design for EC The Final Chapter, as it focused on an evil cabal of beings known as the Infernals, who would clash with the original cast with the entire timeline as the prize. The game would have ran with this concept so hard that it would actually factor into the gameplay, with the fluctuating timeline, changing character appearances, movesets, and even story, with 30 possible endings overall. Before full production was given the green light though, Michael was called in by his boss at Sega USA and was handed some bad news. I was devastated. At this point, we had an EC handheld game, choose your own adventure books and comics. There's all this interest to license it out, and then out of the blue, as I'm working on the design, I get asked by Joe Miller to join him on the balcony, his other office. He drops the bomb that despite selling extremely well, EC is dead, period. The company will focus on Virtua Fighter. This does indeed confirm Sega's intentions, as they felt with only so much money to spend, fighting game fans might only buy Eternal Champions in lieu of Virtua Fighter, and Sega wanted their arcade fighters to be the most prominent. Since Fighting Vipers, Last Bronx, and VF all shared the same Model 2 engine and would have both arcade and home ports, this was deemed as the most cost-effective choice, and with Sega of America's dwindling influence, they were powerless to protest. Discouraged but undaunted, some members of the EC team moved on to Sega Sauce's short-lived Heat.net service, which was a website where one could play online games via their personal computer, and Netfighter, a would-be successor to Champions, was one of the available games. Although, like similar online ventures, Heat.net didn't last especially long, with the website shutting down in 2000, with its various titles lost to the Digiverse. Now, as for an actual sequel or follow-up to Eternal Champions, well, that's a bit more complicated. In 2017, Michael Lanham made a public poll to gauge interest in a revival, but since Sega was unwilling to sell the IP, it would need to take on a slightly different form. Eternal's successor, as it was dubbed, had some very early rudimentary work done on it, with these scanned screenshots being the only available media. Unfortunately, the project fizzled out, with Mr. Lanham citing that no publishers expressed any interest in it and ruled out crowdfunding as a viable option. While hindsight is 2020, had Challenge from the Dark Side released on the Genesis, it might have bolstered the franchise up even further and dissuaded Sega of Japan from being so dismissive. It is indeed a strange case of a publisher focusing all their effort on just one series instead of trying to grow two, especially since they appealed to very different types of players. The reason why Midway's other fighting games failed is because they were so similar to Mortal Kombat, but Eternal Champions, with its emphasis on storyline and violence, was the polar opposite of Virtua Fighter's almost non-existent storyline and realistic combat mechanics. But in the end, I guess we'll never truly know if both franchises could have coexisted with each other. So there you have it. Thanks to the additional sleuthing by Mick, we can now call the case of the not-so-Eternal Champions closed. Know of any other hard-boiled, filth-encrusted stories from the underbelly of the gaming world that you'd like to see in a future case file? Then head on over to the VIP Patreon offices to nominate what you'd like me to investigate next, here on the Flophouse Files.